Good evening. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tonight, the rest of the crew is out and about doing things like, getting ready for Thanksgiving. So I'm here. I'm going to talk about some stuff. And in case this is your first time, welcome to Shop Talk. General idea is it's Monday. Although I agree with Anders. Can it be Friday? I'm okay with it being Friday. But it's Monday. It's after work. Kick back, enjoy. Let's talk about a little bit of stuff. And we've got plenty of stuff to talk about. So last week, bunch of conferences. There were 3 of them that I could mention offhand. Pass Summit and Microsoft Ignite were both in Seattle. Live 360 was in Orlando. Tracy was at Pass Summit. I was hoping she would pop on here so we could talk about her session. Microsoft Ignite, a lot of big news came out. We'll talk a little bit about that. And Live 360, I'll give you the kind of full rundown. Anders, you went to Summit. All right, talk about it. What'd you think? What were your thoughts? In the meantime, I'll talk about Live 360 just a little bit. So this year, there was definitely a huge theme on Copilots, OpenAI, a lot of LLMs and generative AI concepts that we've been talking about for the last several months. One of the keynotes was developer evangelist at GitHub. There were quite a few sessions on Azure OpenAI, on OpenAI in general, on using these tools, and had quite a few conversations where generally I was Dr. No, the naysayer. But that said, still interesting to get some perspectives, especially from people who are regularly using tools like Copilot and some ideas on what they use to improve the quality. I think the I don't know, mutual agreement, the area of mutual agreement is basically, look, a tool like a Copilot is not going to make you a good developer. It's not going to teach you how to use a language. What it will help you with is once you do understand the language, once you are good at your job, it will help you make your job faster. And that's what the driving force looks like at this point. I'm willing to accept that as an argument. I think that the baseline for entry, that you must be this tall to ride the ride, is pretty tall, because the problem is that the metaphor that I like to use so much is these things are like drunken interns. They will very confidently give you an answer that has a high likelihood of being wrong, and they have no clue. So it's up to you to figure out, did you actually get a good answer, or are you going to paste in something that is either non-functional or is broken in some way, or possibly is even a security problem? So Anders mentioned Summit, big reunion as usual, which is great. It's one of the best reasons for Pass Summit. There were sessions. I heard that there were at least 1 or 2 sessions. That's right, the Kimberly Tripp farewell tour. So for people who are not in the know, Kimberly Tripp has said that this Pass Summit was going to be her last event, that she's kind of cutting back, doing more photography. I saw from her blog post that she had a great photo that was a cover of a journal. So let me see if I can pull that up and show it on screen, because it was a good photo as well. And basically she's saying, hey, I've been doing this long enough. Let's take some time for some other things in life. So that's kind of fair. Oh, current biology, that's the one. So if I share this window right here, here's Kim's blog post. Let me drop that in chat. The 30th anniversary of SQL on Windows. Hopefully there was a cake. So yeah, here's the current biology, and this, well, no longer the current photo. So previous biology. This is a very small version of the image. I don't know that I can bump up the size too much, but yeah, that was Kimberly's image. So not bad when you can, get yourself on the cover of a magazine for good reasons, not bad reasons. But Hopefully, people who went to Summit had a chance to meet her to say so long and thanks for all the fish. And actually, it looks like there was a follow-up blog post from today about some of this stuff. So good stuff. Basically, looking good. Cuttlefish, cephalopod, but I don't know. I don't know the specifics. If it's under the water, I typically try to avoid it. I can't breathe under the water, and I don't trust anything that can. It's my philosophy on life. I don't trust anything that can breathe underwater. It's too much room for rogue behavior and trickery. So while that was going on, Live 360, like I mentioned, it was very, very generative AI focused. I had a few sessions in the AI track, none of them generative, strangely enough. Talk on machine learning operations with GitHub and Azure ML. Had a talk on multivariate outlier detection and a full day training on building an outlier detector. So those were moderately attended. I mean, nobody's coming to watch me, but that's cool. I did have people show up, so that was the important part. It was more than one person. That's always important. But yeah, great conference, a lot of great speakers. I just wish that Past Summit and Live 360 weren't the same week so that I could attend both. I have tried to work out the logistics, just I can't get it to work because Summit, I guess if you did something like Monday, Tuesday, you had a pre-con early on, and then Wednesday you went for sessions and you flew out an overnight flight on Wednesday, you could get to Orlando Thursday morning and could spend Thursday at Live 360, but then maybe like get the last day training on Friday, but you'd have to do some weird stuff. Ms. Granger called. She has your solution. I don't believe in time travel either, so we're not doing time travel. I believe in following all the 3 laws of thermodynamics and the idea that time is a flat circle. And how many times have we had this conversation, officer? So that said, good stuff. Also, there was a panel discussion on whether or not large language models will take your job or if they are good developer tools. And I promised the moderator that I would drop in as many hot takes as I possibly could. So I started off by saying, no, it won't take your job. And no, I don't think it's a great developer tool. I think it's an okay developer tool. I mean, I know people are comparing it. This is IntelliSense. And then I asked the question, all right, how many times has IntelliSense failed you? Where you're trying to do something and either it won't show up or it doesn't show the thing that it's supposed to show you. It hasn't updated. We're 20 years into IntelliSense and there are still plenty of problems with IntelliSense. This is orders of magnitude more difficult to pull off, and we're expecting perfection. Not going to happen. So even during the demonstrations, create a database called Anders and see how well and statements work in IntelliSense. Pretty much, yeah. But as far as it goes, even the people who are demonstrating these tools, half the time their demonstrations would fail, and it'd be, no, I know that you can do this because I helped write this thing, or because I've read the documentation, or whatever. And the co-pilot is coming back and saying, nope, you can't do that. It's not possible. Like, yes, it is possible. I know because I've done it. Again, scenarios where I do expect at the margins things will get better. But certainly not there today. And I'm probably going to be a little bit more negative on camera and than I would be strictly in person. Because I think it is worth having that somebody to throw the wet blanket on, because when we're riding the hype cycle that hard, I think someone deserves to throw a wet blanket, because eventually wet blanket person will be right, and then I get to do my victory lap. It's just a matter of how soon that is when the hype falls and people are like, oh, it won't actually, I can't actually just hire a $10 an hour intern and have that person create my fully functional website for me that does, Facebook. I want Facebook, but I only want to pay you $200 for it. And I think it's absurd, but that is the kind of expectation that people have, that, oh, it's going to generate the code for you. So that said, there are some interesting things that you can pull out of this. If you forecast rain every day in Seattle, you'll be more accurate than the forecasters. That's a fair point. Hopefully AI can improve weather forecasts. Well, weather follows a chaotic system, so there's only so much you can do to forecast it. But yeah, estimate rain. You'll be right more often than not. Always, never bring an umbrella though, I guess. I mean, unless you want to be a tourist. If you want to be a tourist, bring your umbrella. If not, you just suck it up and get wet like everyone else. Except for the smart people who brought umbrellas. But then you can point at them and be like, ha, tourist. Meanwhile, you're getting soaked because it's a heavy rain today. But at least you got one over on other people. And isn't that the story of life? Just get one over on other people. It doesn't matter how bad it worked out for you. Speaking of getting one over on other people and questioning how well it's going to work out for you, I think we should talk about OpenAI. Almost, all the locals have hooded jackets instead of umbrellas. Yeah, because it's mostly a mist. And despite the fact that I probably had the greatest transition that Shop Talk history will ever have, I don't know that it's ever going to get better than that. Despite that, I still went back because I had to respond to Anders. But OpenAI, I need to share my screen because things are getting a little spicy for the company. And let me spotlight you. Oh, this is spotlighted. This is spotlit. Let's maximize that. There we go. That'll work a little bit better. OpenAI is dead. Long live OpenAI Microsoft. I mean, you're kind of getting there. And sorry, that wasn't Anders. It was NanoDBA who's I'd respond to stop the greatest transition of all time. But nonetheless, a lot of interesting stuff happening right now. I don't know the full story at this point. I'm interested to see what that full story is going to look like over the next few weeks. But it seems like what has happened is that the OpenAI Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organization, there's also a for-profit kernel inside of it. And they have raised a huge amount of money. Microsoft has dropped tens of billions of dollars into it. Other companies have dropped quite a bit of money into OpenAI. And their CEO, Sam Altman, got dumped over the weekend. And it sounds like what had happened was that there are 6 members of the board. So Altman is one of them. Second one is, let me see if I can pull up the name because it's Greg Bossman, something like that. Greg Brockman, there we go. So he was the former president of OpenAI. And basically, it sounded like there were 4 other board members. They voted to ouster Altman and wanted Brockman to, they wanted him to resign as chairman of the board, but wanted him to stay on as president or something. And basically, Brockman and Altman are good friends. They've known each other since the Y Combinator days. So they've been around together for quite some time. And Brockman said, no dice, I'm out of here too. And then what had happened was Microsoft said, oh, if you're going to get rid of Sam Altman, we're going to open up a new emerging AI organization within Microsoft. And you know what? We're going to hire Sam Altman and Greg Brockman to be at that organization. Meanwhile, as things go even further, there was another link where basically there was a petition going on within OpenAI's employee ranks where a lot of them were saying, well, you got rid of Altman, so unless you bring him back, we're gone. And Microsoft apparently has made overtures to those people as well, saying, You're all welcome to Microsoft and our emerging AI practice. And meanwhile, Mark Benioff at Salesforce is saying, hey, if you're at OpenAI and you want to leave, come join us and work for yet another organization. So, interesting times. So this is one of the articles. There's been a lot that's just been bouncing around over the past couple of days because new information has been coming out, and I get the feeling that the board members, the other board members, really overstepped their bounds on this one. I don't really have a dog in this fight. I'm not sure if there's a correct answer here, except that the board never really stated what Altman did wrong. It was essentially a case of, oh, well, he didn't provide us information for doing board work. And the statement was so vague. There weren't any specifics. There weren't any instances of he was hiding numbers. He was doing something unethical. He was doing something illegal. He was doing something that normally would cause a CEO to get ousted. And it's certainly not like OpenAI was anything other than a money pit where everybody's willing to throw all their cash into OpenAI. So it's not like they're having financial struggles. So normally you would expect a CEO's not getting dumped. And yet this happens, and immediately Microsoft, who owns about a third of OpenAI, says, nah, that's cool, we'll take you. So yeah, Andrew says, all done with no SEC oversight since there's no competition being taken over. Yeah, and also the OpenAI Foundation is a nonprofit. So they're not also even the for-profit part of OpenAI is not publicly held, I think. So it's not something I believe the SEC would even have a domain over because they're not on an exchange. I'm not positive about that, but I believe it's the case. So I think it's there's a private for-profit organization and a broader not-for-profit organization for OpenAI. Marshall says, this may be a case study on how to crash a multi-billion-dollar company even faster than WeWork. WeWork was itself amazing in how well they could waste money. This seems like an absolute own goal because WeWork, at least, it failed because of incompetence. This is just really strange. It seems like there's a part of the story we're not getting, and I'm interested to see what's going on there. Also interested to see how many of the employees who made their threats will leave because, if Sam Altman is joining Microsoft, I'd say he's going to say no to OpenAI. Now, there's also, throwing on with all this other stuff, very recently there's been a lot of talk about the federal government stepping in with regulations on artificial intelligence and language models. And OpenAI has been one of the major backers of these types of regulations because, well, after all, when you're a big player in an established industry, then you'll do everything that you can to keep anybody else out of it. And having a set of regulations come in tends to be a really good method for keeping your control over the industry. Might explain why Google and OpenAI are two of the big players in terms of promoting regulations, especially when they get to be the ones to write it, because it's not like people in Congress know how to write these things. So interesting to see what's going on with this. And I heard some rumors. I don't know how much to understand, discount, whatever, that there was infighting among the OpenAI organization about how much they want to be a for-profit company pushing the latest models and how much they want to be more of I call it AI gatekeeper or AI controller, where they limit the effectiveness of their models or try to prevent people from interacting with them in some ways. And I'm being purposefully vague here because I don't want to get down that rabbit hole too far, just far enough to note that there's a rabbit hole around ethics and politics and social issues, and um, I don't want to go any further than that. Not on Shop Talk. Frankly, nowhere on camera. So, nonetheless, it does seem like there has been some infighting within people at OpenAI. And again, I don't know who's on what side because I'm not that heavily invested in understanding the internal politics of the foundation and the company. But it is interesting to see all of this stuff happening. So that came up over the weekend, and I don't know that it drowned out all of the news. Yeah, in the general public news, this was definitely the big issue. Now, conference news, we also got a lot of stuff coming out from Ignite, much of which was, again, LLM and Copilot related. So really pushing things like Microsoft Copilot. So Microsoft 365 integrations or Teams integrations, or being able to do things like, hey, read through the emails and read through the documents that are on SharePoint and allow people to ask questions in Teams and try to answer questions in Teams. So set up your own internal corporate chatbots based on document libraries that you've held currently. Or PowerPoint allowing you to build me a slide deck based off of this memo or based off of these emails, and getting that foundation. That stuff they've promoted pretty heavily. The other big news that I saw from Ignite was Microsoft Fabric going GA. So that was officially announced, and not surprising. I mean, even back when it came out in public preview, they already said we're going to release it in fourth quarter. My expectation was December, but knowing that Ignite and Pass Summit were going to happen right around that time, that also made a lot of sense. Now, I don't think Fabric is honestly ready for GA. I think there's a lot of stuff missing, and my big concern, and I'm not just concern trolling here, despite the fact that anytime somebody talks about concern, the first thing I think about is, are you really just concern trolling? But big concern here is that Fabric will not be ready for a lot of organizations, and companies that try it out are going to say, hey, I can do this thing in Azure Data Factory, but I can't do it in Fabric's version of Data Factory. Or I can do this security feature in SQL Server, but I can't do it over here. Or I can get this kind of performance in this system, but I can't get it over here. And the answer is, oh, well, wait for that. But what'll happen is, I think, a lot of companies will try it out because, oh, it's GA. It's now fully supported. It's baked. And we'll say, there's a lot missing here. This doesn't feel like a solid integration. With the end result being that they get the impression that Microsoft Fabric is not really what it's led to be, that it's not a great product, and why would I spend my money on this when I could use these other things that actually do have all the functionality I need, even if it means that I have to stitch together parts, or I just stay on premises and don't use that tool at all. And 2 years from now, when all these pieces are in place, the problem is getting those people to come back and try it again, because once you have that impression, a first impression, you only get to make it once. And so it is really hard to change those first impressions because people have a really good job of locking themselves in on initial impressions, regardless of how spurious they may be and how little information they were founded upon, and just ignoring all contrary evidence and doing everything they can to justify their initial speculative opinion making, keeping it for as long as possible, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. So when you give people a chance to make a really bad first impression, a lot of people just will never have that follow-up. And I can see that being a big problem. Whether or not it will actually turn out to be the case? We'll find out. But I know that at least during the preview phase, uh, I've not been part of any direct Fabric implementations, but I have talked to people who have, and a common refrain is there's a lot that is missing. There's a lot that needs to be put in place, and much of it is on the roadmap. So it's not like people at Microsoft are completely unaware that they have no idea they need these things. It's just more of, well, it'll come out in Q1 or Q2 or Q3. It'll come out over the next 6 to 9 months, but it takes time to develop this. And I do get that, but you're also saying it's GA, it's generally available. And when people hear GA, they think, it's done. Admittedly, they still think that when it's public preview. As soon as you go public preview, people are like, the product is done. It's it's now publicly available. And it really isn't. Availability zones for managed instances, that did come out. Also, I believe that there was some announcement around Azure SQL managed instances and link to SQL Server on premises as well. And I need to pull that up because I just read up on it a little bit today. So let me see. Managed instance link. Cloud AG failover is now in public preview. So that is one of the things that is relatively new, and I'll share that link and share my screen. But that did come from Brent Ozar's newsletter. I just took a quick look at that before we went live. So there's that link. Online disaster recovery between SQL Server 2022 and managed instances is now in preview. This is something that they really hyped at the release of SQL Server 2022, saying this will be available. And they had the one-way failover into Azure SQL Managed Instance already in play. This is two-way failover so that you can fail back from SQL Managed Instance to SQL 2022. So that does offer some functionality that we'd been expecting with the SQL Server 2022 release. And, we're a year later for this to come in. It's technically still public preview. This is, hopefully they've had the chance to get it right. Hopefully they've had the chance to, get it to work really well. I would be interested to hear if anybody does actively use this, what their experience ends up being. I've not had a whole lot of experience with companies working with Azure SQL Managed Instances, because that feels like a halfway house between I just want to run SQL Server on VM or on-prem versus just suck it up and do Azure SQL Database. I mean, I get there are some things you need SQL Managed Instance for. Azure SQL Database doesn't support certain functionality. And so it makes sense from a perspective to Microsoft to say, hey, we can offer you sort of platform as a service Azure SQL Managed Instance instead of platform as a service Azure SQL Database, and give you some more options, some more things that we can't give you in the shared space, the shared database space on Azure SQL DB. Things like machine learning services or some of that type of functionality, or anything that really requires instance level information. Think replication or even SQL agent jobs. So basically I understand the notion behind it. I think it's a good business strategy. I just don't see a lot of companies that have used it. So interested to see how this does shake out. And we can see that in SQL Server Management Studio, there's a new bit of information around the link feature. So that'll be available in the availability groups dropdown. Now I'm wondering if Azure SQL Database will have it, or if it's going to be one of those Azure SQL DB features where they just point you to Management Studio. So we'll see about that as well, because it is more of an administrative feature, and Azure SQL DB does tend to push toward I'm going to focus on the developer experience versus the administrator experience. So it may simply be that they don't care, or not don't care, but that they choose not to focus on this scenario and instead put their time and effort into other scenarios. Now, there were quite a few other announcements, and let me see if I can pull up Microsoft Ignite announcements. The book of news is always interesting to read, except that I need to get the 2023 book of news. There it is. So let me pull up that page. I'll drop that in for you as well. So news.microsoft.com has the Ignite 2023 book of news. This is, if you've never looked at this before, there's some fluffery involved. And Anders did post a YouTube video. Can't pull it up for obvious reasons, but summarized nicely on one screen toward the end. Cool. The book of news is more of a complete, like a little bit of fluffery, but there is a lot of here's what Microsoft is pushing at the corporate level. So this is, Ignite has historically been, let's bring your C-levels, let's bring your VPs, let's bring your corporate people and tell them about all the things that Microsoft is really promoting this year. So you can see the very first thing on their list is Azure Machine Learning updates and basically LLMs. So prompt flow. If you've not seen Azure Machine Learning's Studio recently, they have definitely promoted generative models and large language models considerably. They're trying to make a simple single place for a lot of this work between Azure OpenAI Studio and Azure ML Studio. And I could see some of this combining together over the next year or two as well. But some tie-ins, like what has changed in Azure ML, so integration with OneLake. OneLake available as a data store within Azure Machine Learning. And I think that makes a lot of sense because excuse me, I've been fighting allergies all day, so them's the breaks. It's what we do at Shop Talk. We fight through things, most of them self-inflicted. OneLake being one of the key structures of Microsoft Fabric, a really cool idea. I like that. I think that is a core part of what will eventually make Fabric successful. Again, it'll probably take a year or two before it's really successful, but OneLake is extremely interesting as a concept, and I would say this integration with Azure ML, solid idea. I know that Microsoft is promoting Fabric, just in time to be renamed. Marketing will get to it. It's a 2-year cycle. Everything must be renamed every 2 years, and the name must usually be dumber than the prior name. That's also usually a rule. But Microsoft has promoted Fabric as your central location, your software as a service offering for everything across the data platform space, and have also tried to push a lot of data science and machine learning scenarios. In Tara, you mean Azure Entra ID versus Azure Active Directory? Yeah. And I understand the Microsoft people who say Azure Active Directory was never Active Directory. My response is, okay, I agree. I understand that and I agree with it. But you know what? Azure Active Directory still at least makes sense to people as a name. You can say, it's not the same as as Active Directory, but at least it still makes sense as a concept. Now, what does Azure Entra ID mean, or Intra ID? And again, why do you keep picking names that people can pronounce multiple ways? It was to those of us that use it. I mean, it was. So if you were an AD administrator, you would know that there's a difference between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. But yes, if you were a casual like me, or someone who just needed to say, hey, I need rights to a specific workspace or to a contributor on a resource group or whatever, or I need to create an app registration to generate a service principal to do some work, that stuff didn't matter so much. It like just the name Azure Active Directory was still. I heard enough about Active Directory to get an idea that, oh, okay, this is what I need for that kind of user account security stuff. And so for the low information people, it was a good thing. Even for the high information people, I understand there are going to be pedants who will say that it's not Active Directory because there are these differences. It's not the same product. But I'm not sure how much it mattered. And now you're halfway through changing your documentation. A bunch of stuff still says Azure Active Directory. All your Azure CLI commands are still AZ space AD. It's going to be a mess for a while. I mean, it's like when they renamed DocumentDB to Cosmos DB, and there are still places in APIs that say DocumentDB because it's easier to keep it that way. Like we can't just change the API. So, you have DocumentDB. And then the Microsoft people get mad, like, why are you calling it DocumentDB? I didn't call it that. Your DLL still calls it DocumentDB. That's the namespace. So, I don't know. You could change that if you wanted, but then you'd break a bunch of code, and fortunately, Microsoft doesn't break a lot of code due to backwards compatibility problems. And anybody who's gonna get angry about that, I highly recommend you check out the Python world, where it seems like breaking backwards compatibility is a goal versus a unenviable task. So, nonetheless, Microsoft Fabric, they are pushing this as your one-stop shop for everything, including data science and machine learning. Except that I think what we're going to end up with is similar to what we saw with Azure Synapse Analytics. Early on with Synapse, Microsoft, the Synapse team specifically, said, well, you should do all of your machine learning work in Azure Synapse Analytics. That's where your data is. That's where your Spark clusters are. We're going to have all this compute available for you. Just do it all in Synapse. You shouldn't need Azure ML for any of this stuff because your data is in Synapse, your compute is in Synapse, like it's all here. And meanwhile, the Azure ML team had their own implementation of Spark clusters, and were trying to promote, hey, you should do Spark work over here in Azure ML, as well as all the rest of your machine learning work. So you have these two teams both telling you to do all of your ML work in their place and not in the other place. After a while, 6 months, a year, something like that, the Synapse people started saying, well, do your Azure ML work over there in Azure ML as opposed to in Azure Synapse Analytics. And the Azure ML team basically said, if you want a Spark cluster, don't create one over here in Azure ML. Why don't you just create a Spark cluster over in Databricks or in Azure Synapse Analytics? And we landed on this détente where if you have machine learning specific work, do that in Azure ML. If you need the compute from a Spark cluster, we can pull one in from Synapse or from Databricks. And if it's not Spark cluster required, then use your compute from Azure ML. And I think we're going to land on something like that for data science, machine learning tasks in Fabric as well. That early on, they're going to push every data scientist can do all of their work in Fabric compute space. And then eventually they're going to say, well, you know what? Do a lot of this work in Azure ML, and we're just going to make it available to you. We'll make the data available in Azure ML from OneLake. We'll make it easy for you to work with what's in Fabric and to expose that data. For some definition of easy, I actually have a video coming out in the next couple of weeks on integrating Azure ML and Power BI, something that came out 2 years ago. And, well, part of it coming out 2 years ago is that it's tied to the V1 version of Azure ML SDK. And as a result, you can only use V1 services, web services. You can't use the V2 managed online endpoints or batch scoring. And also, there were some other oddities that made it so that the demo scenario, where, oh, you just click a button and then it magically works, doesn't magically work. But yeah, that painful video will come out in a couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that, I suppose. All right, what else is going on with Fabric? Well, AI platform Azure AI Studio. So Azure AI Studio, they're rebranding Azure ML Studio to Azure AI Studio and incorporating the generative AI work. I wonder if there's a good website with Microsoft renaming, like the dead Google products website. That would be interesting. I think there's got to be some salty Microsoft longtime employee who keeps track of all this stuff and has built a site of all the name changes over the years. I would be interested in that. I'm sure someone's got it. It's just a question of finding where it is and whether that's public. Let me jump through it this way. So Azure AI Services, you can see they're really pushing a lot of this. Azure OpenAI updates, vector search, semantic rank, and Azure AI Search, which used to be cognitive search. So they're rebranding a lot of cognitive services, of Azure ML, of these sorts of things as Azure AI. In the compute world, AMD-based Azure virtual machines in preview, and SAP HANA. This is something that Microsoft is also pushing hard. They are quite interested in the SAP HANA market. There are a lot of organizations that spend a lot of money on SAP, and well, SAP is moving away from on-premises installations. They're essentially saying, we want you running in a cloud, either on our specialized configuration, and I forget the name for it, but running on AWS or Azure, or you can run it in Google Cloud and AWS and Azure in your own subscriptions. But they're really pushing away from running on premises. And part of that, I think, is so that they can get more licensing fees out of people. But as a result, Microsoft is seeing they're doing a lot of push for customers who are on premises running SAP, because if you're running SAP, you're spending a lot of money on SAP. So that's a lot of money that somebody else can get. In the data world, because that's what we're here for. Amazon S3 shortcuts are now available. So this is, let me jump down to that. Tying Amazon S3 with OneLake. So data lakes for Microsoft Fabric, now you can point to S3, not just to Azure Data Lake Storage or Azure Blob Storage endpoints, which is good because S3 is still the biggest player in terms of cloud storage. So better integrate with them. I think this is a smarter move that a few years ago was a lot tougher to get through to the Azure data people. Like, I had a conversation, this was years ago, when Polybase first came out for SQL Server. My question was, okay, well, when will we get S3 support? And the answer was basically, well, we want to finish up all the Azure support first, and why would you even want S3? Like, because that's what my company uses. We're on-premises at the time, on-premises SQL Server and Amazon products. So I'm not going to be using Azure Blob Storage in this scenario. Eventually, like, it took until SQL Server 2022 before we got S3 support in Polybase. And I think it's taken them a few years, but they are realizing that you can't pretend that the biggest cloud player doesn't exist. So that's good. There's Fabric is now GA, now part of Microsoft's intelligent data platform, and it looks like there's a little bit more going on with Azure Database for MySQL. They can keep pretending for a pretty long time, oddly enough. Yeah. And in fairness, Azure is a big cloud player as well. They are the second biggest cloud player, but I think they're finally realizing, okay, we can't pretend nearly as much anymore. They'll still prioritize Azure scenarios. There are still a lot of services that will play really nicely with Azure and will kind of play okay with other providers and with on-premises solutions, but they're certainly pushing hard on the Azure side. If you are using SQL Server enabled by Arc, there are several new changes in here. So here we go. Monitoring for SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc is now in preview. HADR, expanded security updates for SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc. So these are GA, whereas the other two items were in preview. So if you are using Arc to manage your on-premises or in AWS, another example of AWS, but you can manage SQL Server, it's SQL Server or SQL Managed Instance or Azure Database for Postgres on-premises in a Kubernetes cluster. You can have the metrics for this go into Azure and manage it in Azure if you want to centralize your administration plane across multiple cloud providers or on-prem plus cloud. So it looks like they are getting more effort in here. I haven't heard of a lot of organizations adopting this, so we'll see. We'll see what the uptake looks like on it. But I would also assume that you probably need to have a lot in place for organizations to adopt it, because this is ultimately saying you're managing a control plane for SQL Server. You'd better have a lot of this stuff in place, or you better have some reason for me to pay extra money to put this in Azure, not just, hey, I like having my stuff in one location because, well, I can have developers write code to pull those metrics into one location, or buy products that give me that information in a similar place. So, we'll see how that works out. For Postgres, there's some additions here. Faster SSD, IOPS scaling, trying to make it so that the Postgres platform as a service offering is a bit more enticing for end users. I know Microsoft is pushing Postgres kind of hard. I guess they're figuring, hey, if you don't want to pay for SQL Server licensing, you can pay for Postgres hosting, and they'll take your money either way. When we look at infrastructure, there's a bit in here, but nothing too exciting, I don't think. If you're in the Microsoft 365 space, there were some interesting updates, but we'll skip that because you can read that on your own. Copilot, as you can see, Microsoft Copilot takes up an entire section here. And if I jump down to it, Copilot and Microsoft Fabric. So we're going to see Copilots everywhere. That's my not really a hot take, because we're already seeing a bunch of Copilots. But here's one for Fabric. So you can build data flows and data pipelines, generate code and functions, build models, visualize results. They may even give you the answers you're looking for. Don't expect it, but you could get it. Copilot for Azure. I actually got to see a little bit of this at Live 360, and that is actually really interesting, because what it's intended to do is to allow you to say, hey, I want to know about these existing Azure resources. I forget what resource it is that I need to look for, and I don't remember what the name is, but it's got this functionality. And it'll say, okay, here's the service. And you can say, that's right. Now, I need to enable, let's say it's an Azure SQL database. I need to enable transparent data encryption on it. And you can have that kind of a conversation and get it enabled. Importantly, you only get to see the resources that are associated with your account. You are only going to be able to perform the actions that you're allowed to do. So you can't use the Copilot as a way of credential escalation, or of asking, so how many SQL Server instances are there in this environment? And it'll tell you, there are 9. And if there's a 10th one that you don't get to see, you won't know that there's a 10th. So there is information, there's enough context that's provided as part of the inputs so that the output result does not expose additional information. You can't elicit from the bot. And better have your tagging standard in place for resources. I'm sure tagging would help with this, but even with tagging, stuff like naming, stuff like just asking for product names, you can also say, hey, I need to stand up a new VM and walk through the process, and it will create either ARM template or bicep script if you want to. So you could say, yeah, I need to create a bicep template for creating a VM. It needs to have a VNet. We need to have 2 NICs. We need to have these rules in place, and kind of get you on the way there. So again, it will not work perfectly. So you will have to understand enough to be able to say, oh, what you're generating is dumb. I'm going to do it a different way. However, it could kickstart some of the development process. One thing they have now is VM images with the proper screen to have an AG set up and ready to go. Private preview so far, I believe. That would be cool once it's generally available, or at least public preview. But yeah, Microsoft Copilot for Azure, that I think is one of the cooler product offerings, because this is a good example of, you have a very complex infrastructure with a lot of services, and you can even ask questions like, so I need to add a new queuing system. Which one should I use? And thinking about this, there are about 8 or 9 separate ways to build a queuing system using Azure components. Event Hub, IoT Hub, Azure Queues, Event Grid. There's like a bunch of different services that I can write into. Azure Tables even. I can write into these different things, read from those different things, and they'll all work in different ways for different scale loads, for different situations. But you get an idea of what would be the recommended way to do that. And this is trained in part on Azure architecture documentation. So they have some of the context of when you want to do event grids versus event hubs versus IoT hubs versus Azure queues, versus a 5th mechanism that I'm not thinking of, versus, well, they're probably not going to recommend install Kafka or use a Confluent client or something like that. But a lot of different options there, and will provide you some additional information. So that actually is an interesting product. I think it's worth looking into, and I think right now it's kind of in the we're talking about it phase, versus the public gets to see it or public gets to work with it phase. I did get to see it at Live 360, but I don't think it's available to us yet. I think you have to be Microsoft internal to really use it, or it might be in private preview at this point. So Bing Chat, if you haven't done that before, if you haven't tried that before, that is actually running ChatGPT 4. So you can mess around with that. That is the cheapest way to use ChatGPT 4, by the way, because Bing Chat is free to everyone. Otherwise, if you're using OpenAI's API, or if you're using Azure OpenAI, you're paying for that. So, there's some benefit in there. Microsoft Copilot for Service. Copilot for Sales, Copilot for Service. Basically, help desk, trying to improve help desk workflows and sales pipelines. We're seeing this in Dynamics. We're seeing this in CRM systems. And scrolling down a bit more, there's more on Microsoft Copilot for Sales. So meetings, recaps, and Teams, combining Insight for Copilot for Sales and Copilot for Microsoft 365. You notice that they're continuously showing, hey, Copilot, Copilot, Copilot. Dynamics, the M365 work is probably coming up down here. This is more dynamic stuff and more dynamic stuff. Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So again, Copilot for Copilot. We might be getting there. Which Copilot do I need to use in order to get an answer that works? So Copilot for M365 Admin Center. I think this is another case. I think complex administrative screens where you think Power BI administration, M365 administration, Azure administration, where there are hundreds of different options and there is documentation on what these options mean, but that documentation is spread out a bunch of different places. And I want to know, okay, well, this is the website, this is the page. How do I generate this resource myself? And yes, you can build ARM templates after the fact. You can take an existing resource and generate an ARM template for it, but it's not the same. It's a lot of stuff is hard coded in. You'll notice the ARM templates that get generated from existing Azure resources don't look anything at all like the ARM templates that you would generate up front. And so having a tool where you could interrogate and possibly get a correct answer is, I believe, a time saver, because you could at least ask, which of these boxes do I need to check to enable some functionality, and possibly get a correct answer. Copilot for Microsoft 365. This one, I talked about the PowerPoint integration, reading an Outlook. I know a couple years ago, Microsoft had a service for meeting scheduler. So they would look at your calendar, they would look at other calendars and would try to say, if I said, have a meeting, set up a meeting with Anders and Marshall. And if we're in the same organization, it would look at our calendars and would try to set up a meeting. And there'd be a little bit of back and forth with emails like, hey, these times are available. And then when everything was settled, I would get an alert that the meeting's in place. But also being able to search through email. Yeah, December 21st of 2034. That makes sense. I believe that will be the day you retire. Maybe the day after you retire. But Word, The Revenge of Clippy. 3 days after. That's a good idea, just in case you have to move it a day or two. You don't want to accidentally have a meeting. So that makes a lot of sense. It's smart, forward thinking. So Word, The Revenge of Clippy, kind of reminds me of when Office 95 came out. One of my favorite stories of disgust and anger is that Clippy was originally going to be a pretty smart AI generated help process. And there's a YouTube video that was very clearly made from the mid-90s, because you could tell from the coloration on the screen, from the haircuts, from what was going on there, the camera, the CRT monitor. So, the camera had this constant scrolling because of frame rate differences. So, and refresh differences. But basically, the original idea behind help in Office 95 was that they were going to use an AI model. This was well before neural networks became popular, because there wasn't enough compute for it. But the basics of how it would work is, depending on what actions you took, it would change the help that would get generated for you. So for example, if you have Excel open and you hover over the file menu and you click the file menu and you're just sitting there, maybe you're moving up and down on those menu options, the tool would assume that you are struggling, you are new to Excel and you're struggling with it and you're not quite sure what you're looking for. And so the generated help would be basic topics. Meanwhile, if you were creating pivot tables, if you were working off of more complicated formulas, you're doing VLOOKUPs, the help would automatically be the more advanced version of that help. Context-sensitive menus. The menus would stay the same. Context-sensitive menus are something I'm not incredibly fond of because I don't like the idea of saying, navigate to the view menu, and then open up this option, and somebody saying, I don't have that option. Not a big fan of that. But this was more of what would show up in help. So if I'm looking, like if I hit F1 and I am building a pivot table, it would actually show me, hey, here's information working within a pivot table. Here's the more advanced stuff. If I am regularly doing VLOOKUPs, it would maybe tie me to a function guide. Whereas if I'm struggling to create anything, it might say, here's how to create a visual in Excel. Here's how to create a graph from a table. Or some of the simpler things. Now, all of this, they finished. They got it developed. It was going to go into Office 95. And they pulled it out at the last second so that they could put more clip art on the CD. So they neutered AI in Office 95 to put more clip art on a CD. And as a result, we got Clippy. We got Clippy the paperclip that would say, hey, it looks like you're writing a letter. Well, in 95, this might not have been the wrong choice. I mean, it probably would have sold more, yes. But it's frustrating to see this technical achievement. That was interesting. It was very interesting. It was well done. And it was all gone because, well, they should have removed Clippy. They should have, well, Clippy would have actually been useful at that point. That's the real thing. What they had to do was they had to turn it into an incredibly simplistic heuristic instead of the more complicated system that they had originally developed, because gotta fit more clip art in. Someone needs a picture of a triangle. So there's a lot more going on with Microsoft announcements, but we did actually get through the top of the hour, surprisingly enough. And with that, I do want to note, tomorrow, our main meeting will actually be online only. I've got stuff that came down where I'm not going to be able to be there in person, and so figured as well, it's the week of Thanksgiving. A lot of people will be out of town. Let's make it online only. December, our main meeting will be in person. Advanced DBA will be online only. December meeting will be hybrid, the main meeting. And we only derailed you once. I derailed myself plenty of times as well, so I'm right there with you, Anders. But if you're here tomorrow, make sure don't show up at Tech Systems. It'll be very awkward otherwise. Just show up online. I did send an email out to anybody who registered. If you do register at the last moment, note that it's online only. Please don't go there in person. Go there in person in December, just not November. Nonetheless, until we see each other, maybe at a in-person meeting, maybe in a future shop talk or wherever, until we see each other next, take care.